Great. A very, very warm welcome to everyone across Zoom and our other social media platforms where we're live broadcasting this, Facebook and YouTube. But of course, a very warm welcome in particular to all the research teams from across the globe who are joining us today as part of the larger program this talk is part of. My name is Francesco Bino and I'm the head of programs at the Global Development Network. This is a public session of a week-long research lab. GDN, the Global Development Network, is hosting as part of the first edition of the AFD-GDN Biodiversity and Development Awards, a three-year joint effort by GDN and the French Development Agency, which generously funds the program. This program supports emerging scholars from the Global South working in the Global South on the challenges of mainstreaming biodiversity protection across sectors, with specific focus on social science research into what works and doesn't, and how it works and why. I'll say very few words about our talk today and about our guest speaker in a second, but I would like first to pass the floor to Sophie Salomon, who's Deputy Director of Research of the Research Department of the French Development Agency, for her welcome remarks. Please, Sophie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Dear colleagues from GDN, distinguished participants, I am very pleased to welcome you to this research lab today. Welcome to the awardees who've been shortlisted and congratulations, obviously. Thank you to the researchers and stakeholders who are giving their time this week to help the laureates mature their research proposals. I would like to emphasize that it is important for the French Development Agency, AFD, that research supports public policies that will attempt to make ecological transitions happen, to better protect biodiversity and fight climate change over the next decade. At AFD, we are convinced that these ecological transitions require support for a better mainstreaming of biodiversity in all sectors across the economy, particularly in agriculture, land use planning, cities, infrastructure, and also financial institutions. But we are aware that these are complex approaches for AFD's clients, and we are convinced that these are extremely important and urgent applied research issues for which social sciences and humanities play a critical role. I would also like to testify that it is fundamental for AFD that researchers in the South are fully supported in conducting this research. Their role will be essential for appropriate public policies to be devised and supported in the countries where AFD supports these ecological and climate transitions. We are aware that this research often requires that we leave our comfort zone and overcome the silos of our respective disciplines. In addition, all the work in global change science shows that it has become essential to call upon collective intelligence to face these challenges. I therefore sincerely invite all laureates to seek opportunities to conduct collective and interdisciplinary work in the course of their research. The purpose of this research lab is certainly to make these efforts easier, but also to help you build interdisciplinary research partnerships. So, on behalf of AFD, I wish you all excellent work and thank you all again, the GDN, the speakers and the laureates, for your efforts and commitment during this whole week. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Sophie. We're of course very proud of this close partnership with AFD, and we look forward to, of course, more editions of this awards program together. I would like now to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Maria Stenseke, who will deliver the opening remarks with a talk titled "It Takes Humans to Make Peace with Nature," on the critical role of social sciences and humanities research for addressing biodiversity loss. Professor Stenseke is a full professor in human geography and deputy dean at the School of Business, Economics and Law at the University of Gothenburg. Her research concerns biodiversity, nature, conservation, and landscape management from a social science perspective. She's leading the research group Nature Society Relations in a landscape perspective at the Human Geography Unit, still at the University Gothenburg, and she has been involved in a large number of national and international research projects and programs. She's also the Deputy Dean of the School of Business, Economics and Law, but also importantly, the co-chair of the Multidisciplinary Expert Panel on Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. She's also a fellow at the Royal Swedish Academy of Agriculture and Forestry, member of a number of research programs, vice president of the Permanent European Conference on the Study of Rural Landscapes. And basically, in other words, I'll stop here because the titles keep going. I think it just, it really speaks to the fact that she's eminently qualified to talk about the role and contribution of social sciences to advancing policy and action on biodiversity. And I would like just to note one thing, that in the email conversation that that followed our invitation to deliver this talk, it emerged very clearly that she agrees with the predicament underpinning this whole program done by GDN and AFD. The fact that there aren't nearly enough Southern social scientists working on biodiversity mainstreaming today. So for all the researchers connected today, you are in very high demand, despite the huge challenges that biodiversity mainstreaming and devising that biodiversity mainstreaming represents for countries around the world. So we are very keen to hear from her. So welcome, Professor Stenseke. I would like to invite you to deliver the opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Well, many thanks, great thanks. And I will share my screen here to hope that looks fine.
Looks great.
Great. Many thanks for inviting me to give this speech on a topic so close to my, dear to my heart, on humans and the critical role of social science humanities research for addressing biodiversity loss. I say during my years as a researcher and also as my role in IPBES, as we pronounce the Interdisciplinary Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, it's very much to educate and assist the increased engagement of social science and humanities. And I say that when we call for nominees and for experts to join our various assessments, there is almost always a shortage of social science and humanities scholars, and to a large degree so from developing countries, from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa. So we work with gap filling, and still it's has been hard for us to find scholars from these side of the science. So I hope my speech can encourage people to come forward, but also inspire more social science humanities research in the field of biodiversity and ecosystem services, or nature contributions as we call it. So that's I'm very glad to be here. And since I understand that my audience here today is mainly from developing countries, I've kept my Swedish picture because I just thought I'll be a bit of an exotic species here then. So otherwise I usually have more kind of global pictures, but now I've given you, through the picture I use, an examples, an image of where I come from. Sorry, a bit. The outline of my speech here today is that I would like to first say why it is the role of social science and humanities in biodiversity research is an issue, and why we need to talk about it. Secondly, then come into what are the contributions of social science and humanities into biodiversity research. And finally, I will give some kind of advices or some clues that I picked from my experiences through the years from IPBES and from my previous research on how to work interdisciplinary, because I mean it's too often underestimated that the challenges or the issues one have to face. I wouldn't scare you away, say it's too complicated, but there's a kind of basic advices I would like to bring with you, so you don't have to repeat or kind of reinvent the wheels in that sense. But starting off then, why is the role of social science humanities in biodiversity research an issue? And maybe this is very familiar to you all, but if we look at the still existing Aichi biodiversity targets that was due to be fulfilled last year, and we all know they are not reached, and they will be refined and reformulated to a new set of targets this year in Kunming. Reading the targets as such, I just have the illustration for it here. One recognizes in many of them, it is about humans and the human society. Just starting with the target 1. By 2020 at the latest, people are aware of the values of biodiversity and steps that can take to conserve and use its sustainability. So how to address the people, how to reach out, how to make them aware. That's certainly social science humanities within the realm of the research carried out among social science humanities. But also, if you look at the other targets, it's about regulation, it's about law, it's about governance, and these issues are studied. And there are a number of environmental researchers, both in social science and humanities, that certainly could infuse and improve the way we address the challenges related to biodiversity. And even more so, of course, if we take starting the global goals, the Agenda 2030, where it's very clearly stated in the preamble, so to speak, about that those 17 goals are integrated and indivisible. So one cannot kind of go for 1 or 2 goals and then skip the rest, but one has to see that these are connected, they very much interact with each other. So for whatever one are aiming at, for example, in the case of IPBES then, life on land and life below water, it has to be done in such a way that it's kind of that's not undermining the chance to reach other goals. And in fact, it's in many cases very less likely to reach even the goal number 14 and 15 on life on below water and life on land if one doesn't consider poverty, health, and so on, good jobs, economic growth, innovations. So one has to see them together, and that's also a reason for why we need to work interdisciplinary. In IPBES, there have been from the beginning a very clear aim to have a broad approach to knowledge, a broad set of competencies engaged. And therefore, some years ago, the Executive Secretary Anne Larogauderie and the then chair of IPBES, Bob Watson, we had a note in Nature on biodiversity that IPBES reaches out to social scientists, and we kind of call for more of social scientists and humanities people to engage in IPBES. It was kind of echoed by the editorial pieces they made, but major biodiversity panel desperately seeks social scientists. I'm quite happy for that formulation because it is, yeah, to some extent, I'm happy to say we are desperate to bring in this if we are to properly address the global challenge of biodiversity loss and loss of ecosystem services. Since you're a biodiversity researcher, I take due to the call or the profile of this call for funding, I take that you are familiar with the IPBES, and that you also know that a couple of years ago, in May 2015, IPBES delivered a global assessment report on biodiversity and ecosystem services. That I would say, if you haven't gone into it, it's a rich source of knowledge on the kind of state of knowledge we have, and a summary and synthesis of existing research. IPBES, that global assessment, as for all work of IPBES, is based on the conceptual framework that were decided in quite a longish process in 2015. And here I will not go into details, just to illustrate that this is the way IPBES work, with connecting nature, which is in this big box, through the nature contributions to people, through human well-being, but also a number of arrows in between, and not the least to stress that institutional governance and other indirect drivers are in the very middle of the model. This is kind of, we will not solve the issue of biodiversity loss or change the negative paths if we're not looking into also these institution and governance boxes, because that is very importantly where we in many ways need to start to find a way forward. And we have to do it in consideration of what are the contributions to people, to various groups of people, and how do that kind of fulfill the societal goals and Agenda 2030 goals related to human well-being. The IPBES Global Report concluding in this is a figure of what needs to be done, one could say. And it's, once again, sorry to show a complicated figure, but just give it a slight understanding. These blue and grayish part here, there are the drivers, indirect and direct drivers that we need to push in order to get kind of the blue and green planet we wish for, or going up on that path towards a more blue and green planet. But in order to do so, the IPBES experts in this global report, they identified a number of governance interventions that is about capacity building, cross-sectoral cooperation, preemptive actions, decision-making in context on resilience and uncertainty, environmental law. And they also identified a number of crucial kind of issues to start with, or aspects that need to be considered on this way. Like embrace diverse vision of a good life, other visions that kind of now brings us to where we are now, where the status is too much. And then I speak, of course, for the Western countries and the rich part of the world, that where we put too much of our values and visions, or what is a good life in things and unsustainable livings. We need to reduce that and reduce the consumption and waste. We need to find what values of life in other things than increased consumption. We need to find other values. At the same time, also reducing inequalities, make this an inclusive way, listening to also the marginalized groups, in order to kind of not leaving anyone behind, or we are not leaving no one behind, which is kind of the slogan in the Agenda 2030. And there are other things on the list here. As you might recognize, then, coming back to the crucial role of social sciences, humanities, these are very much issues that are addressed in social science humanities research. And therefore, in order to find the solution, we need to look into these knowledges and need also to expand and advance in these dimensions of what I would call then biodiversity research, because these aspects on governance, values, power, justice is also biodiversity research, certainly, since these are so much needed in order to push the drivers in a better direction. I've just, for this, since I understand that you are now planning, many of you in the audience, you are a laureate and you are planning to mature your applications. I just couldn't help it but to pick some shortly from my experiences what I would like to see as a social scientist. And I would say it's a broad field, of course, social science, humanities, and I come from a qualitative social science background, so that is what I'm speaking from. And I see there are so many attempts, and many of them, I would say, are not using the full potential of what social science humanities can give. And therefore, I draw this kind of gradient just to show you some where you could be, but also what I would like you to strive for. So I named it as Nature Science Attitude to Social Science Humanities in Biodiversity Research that concerns human and the human society. So I'm not talking about all nature science research in biodiversity. There are certainly aspects like, well, physiological details or whatever we can say that is very little to do with social science. But if you are, and as I understand the call here, you are expected to work interdisciplinary, just some issues, or maybe some warnings or some stimulation where I would like you to go for. So in this, and that is kind of, I would say, the worst case is that the researcher from natural science, they don't even recognize that these issues they bring forward are concerns humans. And as an example, I would take that some months ago, an open letter to the lead authors of a movement calling the Protecting 30% of the Planet for Nature. And here was a number of social science researchers, knowledgeable social science researchers from mainly the global south, that brought forward some kind of inconvenient issues in this call for protecting 30% of the planet for nature, where they say that you had not considered how many people would be affected, or hadn't consulted them. You have kind of overlooked, it seems, to the decades of social science research about the cost of loss of access to land and the result of conservation policies, that they can deep the sense of loss of culture and status. There were proposals that kind of ignores research on tourism and the fact that tourism industry doesn't generate revenues to rural farmers. And these was just some issues on the list, and it's kind of concluded with this would even kind of continues the colonization of developing countries in a way, but by kind of with nature conservation premises, and so they were rather critical to all the aspects that were left out in this call for protecting 30%, which didn't say that those society were totally against protecting 30%, but they just that there were a number of consequences for humans that were not thought through or included. Continuing the gradient, I would say that next step would be to that people or natural science research ignorant that there is social science research addressing their issues. So they kind of start from scratch and reinvent social science humanities. And of course, then without knowing in what has previously done, what is kind of the recognized methods to do studies, what do we already know, and so on. So you will not get that far if you don't see what is already done in the field. I have also seen that there are natural science that recognize the need for social science humanities, but they do not engage social science humanities competence. They think it's fine to do it themselves. It seems to be feasible. I wouldn't say that they never success, but what often happens is what Martin have summarized in a quite recent article that was titled 4 Common Problems in Environmental Social Research Undertaken by Natural Scientists, where she lists that the oversight of literature, the unfamiliarity with social scientific literature that kind of makes this certainly not to become the research front. One are inexperienced with social scientific methods, working with interviews, for example, or contextual analysis in a way that kind of is not optimizing what one could collect. There's a lack of training in analytical methods, how one in social science humanities connect to previous studies, theories, and do kind of thick description in that way. So it's not just kind of processing the data itself, but it also relates very much to previous research. And then for the inadequate reporting of the results, not kind of putting into the broader context, leaving out important information. Coming further up on this, still in not an optimal way of doing it, there are natural scientists invite social science and humanities to predefine roles and having a definite approach, which means that they say, okay, we want to have you in, this is what we think you should do, and this is the approach we are working on. Then not opening up for having a kind of joint or mutual discussion on how do we define the problem, what could we do, how do you foresee what you can do in this. And that this issue is very often mentioned in social science critical literature on when they work with environmental issues. Close to that is to involve social science humanities scholars, but keeping implicit hierarchy on perspectives and power. So it's not as definite as the bullet before, but it's still kind of an implicit limits to how much you can change the framing of the project. Once again, an example, and this is, I'm sorry if I'm insulting someone in group, but it took an illustration of a model how you work with ecosystem services, and this use the one that provisioning, culture, regulating, and I read into this that it has said that you need to have, it needs to be measured by figures. You need to have a measure to take it. You need to quantify it. And you need to fit into the boxes of provisioning, cultural, and regulating to talk to this. These are the fixed boxes. And then you come as a social scientist or a humanities scholar, and you do research on these images are all on, well, outdoor recreation now in this case, but it could also have been on other livelihood issues. And see the kind of the multitude and multidimensional way of how humans interact with their physical surroundings. And far from all of these could be put into kind of these boxes. It could be easily measured, and it varies between people. It varies between socioeconomic groups, and there are indirect connections and so on. And also, when you kind of limit what is cultural, surely the provisioning, the crops, how you or how you use the maple syrup are also cultural aspects to it, which is my next point. In the previous model, provisioning food would be a provisioning service, but these two illustrations of food that is maybe not everyone would like to eat if they're not very, very hungry, shows that food is so much more than nutrition. It's about culture, tradition, identity, cohesion. To the left is a man from my own home country smelling the fermented herring. That is a specialty in parts of Sweden. I don't eat it, and it smells really terribly, I had to say. And that is kind of what foreigners usually mention when I say horrible food. On the right here is a certain herb that I guess some of you knows better than me, but it's not a herb, it's a larvae and a fungi that together makes something that's very attractive for consumption in parts of Asia, while in other parts of the world it certainly doesn't look as something to eat. But my point is, food is so much more than nutrition. It's certainly about culture and identity, and that it needs to take care of as well. But if you come to very kind of fixed box of what to do, then these aspects will be missed out. Well, fine, of course, and what I'm arguing for by showing these kind of not optimal ways of doing cooperation is that I would like to see and would like you to aim for that you jointly address societal challenges with mutual respect, together with colleagues from other disciplines. Kind of a memory verse here in the middle of my talk, and that is, do not assume that everyone will agree on the problem or how you formulate the problem, but one needs to be open and bring people in. I know you've already formulated your projects, but still invite with kind of an open mind then at this stage. So coming to my next point, what are then the contributions from social sciences and humanities? This is of course a broad spectra, and I make use first of the picture here or illustration made by Bennett and his co-authors some years ago that kind of tried to list, wrote an article that instructively showed, or is good to read when to show kind of the breadth of what social scientists and humanities engage in, to get an idea of what aspects could be brought in. And here he sorted into classical social sciences, more applied ones, and the arts and humanities. And shows then in the article in a kind of very structured way that this has to do with individual attributes, with social processes, and with social phenomena. And it's cut in very different ways in compared to natural science many times. And also, it's not a kind of homogeneous research front as is seen in natural sciences, but between the various approaches and methodologies and the theories in these right variety of disciplines, there could also be contradictory results that from kind of both from many ways could be perfectly correct. But if you're a quantitative economist, you might, with some presumptions and theories into your research, you might come to opposite results to, for example, an anthropologist. And you can both have been doing perfect according to your kind of the methods. I will give you some ideas from a structure I think is useful when thinking about social sciences and what they could provide, and social science, humanities. And one aspect is dimension. It's the contextual one. To provide social context, documenting the variability between people, would also could help to show kind of the injustices, distributional problems between rich and poor, and the marginalized, how they kind of are affected, and also to understand practices, why people doing what they're doing, and then kind of within kind of overarching question, what societal aspects influence the physical environment and the processes don't change. And then, of course, the next question, and that you need to have this to understand how then to solve it or handle the problem. Some disciplines working with these issues are my own, human geography, but also you can see landscape architecture, environmental history, and these just to mention a couple of them. An example for my own research, I hope you can follow me in these pictures, titled Farmers are Key Species of Biodiversity. Up here are pictures, I'm not sure you see them very well, but of rich biodiversity. It's of butterflies, of flowers, and it's kind of the hierarchy from plants to the insects thriving on them, and also, if one look carefully, some predators on the insects. And this kind of ecosystem ways of thinking. And the conditions where I come from is a very forested country. We need to keep some grazing animals. We come in a special corner of the world where biodiversity is needing more grazing animals, because otherwise we will lose biodiversity. I know that is not the case all over the world, but our problem is more rather that becomes too many trees taking over what has kind of biodiversity have been established by thousands of years of human interaction with cattle. Anyway, to keep up this system, to keep some of the cattle there, not just converting everything to spruce forests, and that will then lay the ground for richer biodiversity, you need to have farmers around. They in that turn depends that there are good roads, there are schools around, there is knowledge for how to do things, that are healthcare, so they kind of are not leaving the countryside to say, no, we prefer to live in the cities because just conditions here is not good for raising a family. My spouse won't find a job. It's also important that there are long-term policies, so you can rely on what the investments you do in the agriculture. You can live a good life with there are shops around, that you can make a yield of what you're doing, and also that you're just not seen as somebody that receives subsidies or something from the general public, but there are also some appreciation and understanding around. So these aspects, roads and long-term policies, healthcare, certainly in my country are related to keeping a rich biodiversity. Going to more broader and coming back to the IPBES global assessment, what is shown in that one, and I think that's very important, it's how much of the land, to talk about the context, how much of the remaining terrestrial areas with low human intervention that is in fact land areas traditionally owned and used by indigenous people, and how large share of the designated protected areas that are also used by indigenous people. And that is a very important knowledge to both to listen to the indigenous peoples way of living on the land, to see what clues can we give, how to continue to manage them, but also, of course, to pay respect to the existing cultures, to their and to make kind of justice and being inclusive in working on the land and working with nature protection. Second aspect I would like to bring up what social science humanities are working with is managerial. And this is maybe what is quite commonly thought of, examining how decision making and management can be arranged and processed. How to organize political administrative structures, how to make decisions, how can we communicate, how can we reach public participation, where in nature conservation and in IPBES reports say inclusive governance is crucially important. And then also how are different groups of people affected, distribution and fairness, to connect to kind of the justice aspect that is also in the Agenda 2030. I've listed a number of disciplines here as well: political science, law, economics, behavioral science, communication studies, organization studies, and they will give different clues to it. So it's not one can pick one of them, but or at least one need to be aware of what limits are to those experts one picks. Just a couple of examples here as well. And coming back to Sweden, here you see the Baltic Sea, which is between my own country, Germany, Poland, and you have Russia and the Baltic states over here. On this thin island, but this is about 140 kilometers long, so it's not small as it looks on the map. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the southern part of it, since year 2000, because there are vast areas of traditional grazing that without the grazing, they will lose the biodiversity qualities. This is mainly private-owned land. You need continued animal husbandry to keep the biodiversity, and there are significant economic funding through the EU system and so on. And then the issue is how to bring this to be kind of a inclusive way of working, to encourage the farmers to be, how to distribute the subsidies in the right ways, and how might in a way also that kind of are most optimal for the biodiversity management. Another example is this book. It was a beautiful, I think it was 10-year project or program, or one could say, funded by the UK government on ecosystem services and poverty alleviation, on governance and also trade-offs by governance, that is available on the internet. I'm afraid I think I forgot to put it on the literature list I have in the end, but showing good solution how you can combine poverty alleviation with increased quality of the biodiversity, but also problems or risk or what could be unintended or not so very good outcomes when it comes to poverty, how sometimes some solution made the marginal people more marginalized, or that women, for example, kind of were negatively affected by the solution that came on. So this is a book also to show kind of the managerial effects, written by scholars from many different disciplines. Finally, I would like to bring up what I call the discursive dimension of social science humanities research. And I think this is often what nature science is a bit more unfamiliar, or it's further away from nature science, how they work. But this is about showing how framings, concepts, and categories matter. What are the accepted truths? What does it mean that you frame what nature is, what culture is, how you define drivers, the methods you use? How do these concepts and discourses change over time, and what does that mean? What are the power relation within the research or the knowledge generation, and who do really decide in these issues that kind of makes, though we think it's just science or not knowledge, it makes there are power relation within and there is kind of also affecting various groups of people. There is in fact a strand of science that had developed in this field that kind of, just because the nature conservation have been often too blind to the consequences for people in the actions taken, which is called then political ecology. That I think could be of interest to combine projects with, to kind of have a critical eye on what one's doing. These kind of studies are also carried out in science technology studies, in anthropology, in philosophy, and I of course had to admit that some of these fields are it demands some kind of some of the literature is not easy digested, but there are also a number of kind of research at the bridging through the more abstract ways of reasoning and the more applied. Just to bring up some issues to there, one is, what is nature? I mean, that's a kind of philosophical issue. At the same time, it has implications for how we fund things, how we conserve things, what we think we should keep and maintain, and often it kind of have implications also within the biodiversity sector, that we might miss some groups of species or organisms that we kind of didn't think of. In this case, and this is from a pasture in southern Sweden, it's important to recognize that 35% of the threatened species in Sweden, according to the Red List, are related to the agricultural landscape, and mainly to these kinds of lands or semi-natural grasslands. And that means, and that's why what I said before, we need to keep grazing to keep the kind of what we have promised according to the Convention on Biodiversity. And if we do kind of try to make a line between nature that is more wild and this that is co-created, then we will miss out 35% of the red listed species in Sweden. This kind of broadening the tent idea is also part of why IPBES choose to not just use the established concept ecosystem services, but rather nature's contributions to people in its framing of kind of what do we gain, or what benefits and these services do we get, or are we provided from the rest of nature. And one of the reasons for this kind of broadening the tent, and I should say the ecosystem services is included as one way of formulating nature's contributions to people. But what is rarely included in ecosystem services is this contextual approach, which is a context-specific perspective that's often kind of common among indigenous group and local, indigenous and local knowledge, as we frame it, or local communities, one say in the CBD language, that kind of are certainly not familiar to or very resistant to put their relation to the rest of nature and their kind of interlinked relation to put it in a square system that is the other kind of dimension of it, and you can say there's a gradient here, where we're in a more nature science or quantitative science systematic way talk about various kinds of nature contributions to people, similar to the ecosystem service way of thinking, but with saying that, for example, there is as with food, it's not just a material but also non-material, and that goes with other kind of materials, with energy, and certainly so with the experiential learning and so on. And saying then that the concepts matter. If you say the ecosystem service is only instrumental and what you can measure, then certainly we leave out many things, and we leave out dimensions that are important for a good quality of life, not only to indigenous people but also to many other of us in the on the globe. Just to say, there are some differences between natural sciences, social science, humanities, that, or mainly social science and humanities, with a qualitative approach to in contrast to natural science, that could be good to be aware of. and should not scare away. You shouldn't be scared of. And one is that the system approach that characterizes the natural science compared to the human intentionality in social science humanities. Humans are much less systematized, and there could be sudden changes to the human society that you cannot predict or put into a model, not very easily at least. The fall of the Iron Curtain in Europe, for example, or the sad events in Rwanda with the genocide, these kinds of things that not only changes the human society, but also how we relate to the lands. And that goes with next point also with causality and dialectics, that there might be kind of a multidimensional outcomes and multidirectional as well. It's not just cause effect, but there could be back loops and so on that one needs to discuss. Which also interlinked, of course, to the ideas of that one can work with indicators and modeling. And what is often now in the projects I'm engaged in said that it needs to be connected to narratives and trajectories and thick descriptions to capture what you cannot capture with single indicators. And in IPBES we'll be talking about the bundle of indicators, bundle of social and ecological indicators, which also kind of are includes what one cannot measure that are needed. This bundle is needed to respond to global challenges. And one other way to say this is instrumental approaches versus relational approaches. I mean, instrumental, that this is measurable. The relation is more, it depends on the situation and the context. So my final part, and then some clues to how to work interdisciplinary. And this is, it's not published stuff really. It's more from the experience I made, and to some extent what others have written about interdisciplinary work. And I'd say this is still a field that we need to look into more. I've heard the call for increased interdisciplinarity for almost all my research life, and still it's very, the advance in the field is very, very slow, and it's too common that people or research groups are reinventing the wheel, so to speak. But in practice, and this is about, to some extent, about the attitudes to keep. My first advice would be to accept the difference between scientific approaches. Too often one hear that, well, it has to be measured. You must be able to quantify it, and you need to, as I said before, fit into this kind of way of doing things. But I think to have a good interdisciplinary work, I would strongly advise you to accept the difference between scientific approaches and do not expect that. Often one thinks that one are more similar, there are more similarities than it is. So can embrace the differences, so to speak. I borrowed a figure from Luxus, a sustainable research center in Lund University, Sweden, which talk about problem-solving research and critical research, where the problem-solving research are not only natural science, but much that side, kind of the physical solutions, and the critical research that they recommend it to be combined with is then about how have the issue been framed, what criteria were used, what definitions were made, what kind of what did you reduce away that might be of importance? How did this fit to various kinds of groups of people and so on? Just to repeat and come back to what I said before. And these could then go hand in hand for land use research, biodiversity loss, and so on. And both of them has to do with the scientific understanding, scientific quality, sustainability goals, and the pathways, sustainable pathways forward. And both are needed to have a kind of high scientific credibility. Another advice when you meet in interdisciplinary teams is to find where you can meet intellectually. There's kind of not a hierarchy. Often that is when you are problem-based, solution-based. Some areas where one can meet is often the future where kind of no one have been. So discuss that. The limited areas, I see a wrong spelling here, but I mean a piece of landscape where you can both have social, human, and physiological, biological aspects in one's place, and you can discuss the interaction between it from a kind of more equal points of view. And I would say also to scenario building, if you then accept that there's various ways of understanding what a scenario is. It's not just prediction, but it also to show possibilities or doing backcasting and so on. And in this kind of talk about the future and working with scenarios, you might meet and be open to various ways of addressing future. And I would also recommend and recognize interdisciplinary as a specific competence. It doesn't necessarily go with scientific excellence in kind of the in narrow disciplinary sense, but you might to some extent then need to kind of be outside your comfort zone and look into other aspects in new ways. And might be other people that lead those processes. Just some more, that it takes time. That's a usual mistake. You think it's just bring together us in a room and then we'll solve it. But it takes time. You'll recognize you have different words for things, the concepts you use, different approaches, and kind of to reach a common ground there. It takes time to understand each other and to reach some kind of agreement how to process. Collaborate with critical tolerance. You should, of course, tolerate that you're different. At the same time, don't hesitate to kind of ask critical questions. That could also help to kind of inlet collaboration that I can develop my own disciplinary thinking because I get those interesting, important questions from you. There are a number of previous experiences, so look at them. You don't have to reinvent the wheel of interdisciplinary, but build on what already is done. I shouldn't say there's a lot, but so I could encourage you to also to keep it and help to put the building brick into your experiences and challenges and what worked in your interdisciplinary collaboration. And finally, make a plan for interdisciplinary interactions. Often you kind of combine the interdisciplinarity with that you also do your interdisciplinary work. My recommendation, this is kind of a timeline where you sit in various lines and beginning and finish together. In the meantime, go out and do your disciplinary research, meet regularly and discuss and see what you have come up with. But then kind of allow your in the various teams to have your specific research field, so you then can bring back to kind of the joint discussion. That was a little from me on my perspective of the use of the critical role of social science, humanities, and also how you can make that work together with good natural science in a joint research project. Thank you.
Many thanks to you, Professor Stenseke. I think this is what you managed to do is quite extraordinary, at least from a point of view, because you really managed to bring together in a very accessible way, at the same time, policy frameworks, the scientific literature, and a lot of professional wisdom as well. And I really appreciate, in particular, the call for being practical and concrete and realistic in terms of what one can do, which is of course always a challenge, particularly when you're a researcher competing for a grant, right? You have this, of course, tendency to want to do the best possible, the most possible, to actually get the grant. So I'm sure the 22 teams who are connected will, you know, I hope they'll make the most of your talk. For those who haven't been able to follow us live, we'd like to post the talk on our YouTube channel so that others can also access it. So thank you very much once more, Professor Maria Stenseke, and yes, we'll be in touch very soon then. Thank you.